go.
Wonderful, Jackie. Well, to answer your question about who is 4SA, why do we exist? In a nutshell, we exist to protect and promote and uphold our constitutionally guaranteed rights to religious freedom. And it is so important that we do so because freedom of religion, which is enshrined in our constitution in section 15 specifically, but also in section 9 and even in other sections, isn't just a single right. It's like a basket of human rights. It's freedom of conscience, thought, belief, opinion, expression, association, assembly. And these are very much foundational rights that you would expect to find or hope to find in any democratic society. And yet, unfortunately, what we have found, and it's a global trend, is that these critical foundational human rights are very much under threat and in danger of erosion. And so we exist to basically protect, promote, and uphold those. Now, we are a legal advocacy group, which means that we do so basically using the law to defend, to engage and involve. But specifically, what we are is we are faith neutral. So we protect all faiths, all people who have no faith at all for that matter, because everybody should have the right to believe whatever it is they want to believe. That is what freedom of religion truly is. And therefore, we're not doctrinally for or against any interpretation of any scripture, for example. You're entitled to believe what you want about any tenet of faith or no faith at all, as I said. And very importantly, we also are politically neutral. We work, in fact, across the board with a broad cross-spectrum of political parties, because within the political construct that we have in South Africa, there are fortunately many, many people who are as dedicated, maybe if not more so, than we are to upholding and promoting religious freedom rights.
Wonderful. So that is Michael Swain, who is the managing director or director of operations. Michael,
Executive director. Executive director. You have to give me my exalted title, Jack. My exalted title.
Thank you. Thank you. Your executive director, he often interacts specifically with church leaders, church members, and obviously setting up a lot of the 4SA media liaison, because that's so important. And then we've got Nadene Badenhorst. She is an advocate. She gave us a very interesting lesson recently on the difference between advocates and attorneys. And Nadene, you can even test me because I do remember, but don't test me right. But don't test me right now. And Nadene, tell us, as far as 4SA is concerned, you know, obviously, as Michael reiterated, it's important that you fight for the rights across the spectrum, because actually, if the faith community in general, not just the Christian community, but together with the Muslim community and the other communities, if we stand together, our voice to government is a lot stronger. So that's why, you know, by default, defending for Christian faith, it actually has an advantage to do it for everyone else rather than to have no faith in any spectrum. But tell us, Nadene, on a day-to-day basis, what does 4SA do? Because you obviously are an advocate in your professional capacity. Yeah. Do you work full-time on 4SA, or do you have to fly to the Supreme Court? How does it work?
I do. I have no social life. No, I'm joking. It's very much the workload is definitely increasing, Jackie, as there are increasing number of bills and government policies and court cases, you know, coming before the courts where our religious freedom is under threat. So religious freedom is really the right to believe in our hearts, whatever we want to believe or not believe, but then also the right to freely say what we believe and the right to live out our beliefs, and not just in the privacy of our homes, but also in the public square. And it's particularly these last two aspects, the freedom to say what we believe and the freedom to live out our beliefs, that are increasingly under threat, both in government policy, in bills that come before Parliament, and in court cases. And so what 4SA does is we work in all of those arenas. We literally on a daily basis screen government policy that's coming through, draft legislation or bills coming before Parliament, to see, are there any potential threats to our freedom as people of faith to either say what we believe or to live out our beliefs. And then we make written and oral submissions. We engage with government, we engage with Parliament to see how that policy or the legislation can be amended to make sure that our religious rights remain protected. And then also, of course, in the courts, where, as I said, increasingly, particularly Christians, Christian pastors, ministries, independent faith-based schools, professional people, parents, you name it, are being dragged to court simply for sharing their beliefs or living it out. And then 4SA will get involved either as a principal party or as a friend of the court to make sure that even before the courts, our religious rights remain protected.
Absolutely. And I think that's the key, is there is a certain element of what you do that is reactive, and then there's a huge element that's proactive. And I think that is very important, is you need both. In fact, in an ideal world, we would be proactive about everything, but that takes millions and millions and millions to do that. So given the limited resources you guys work with, I think you've done a fantastic job to date. I will get into it later and ask you a little bit about the victories and the challenges you sit with. But coming to tonight's topic, so we said basically when we were looking at this webinar, what are some of the key issues that we think Christians need to be educated on right now at this moment? And again, to those of you at home, you can go and look at past webinars to see what some of the topics have been. But tonight's topic in particular is a post-Christian South Africa. What will happen to Christianity if we continue our current legal and socio-political trajectory? And obviously that is not specific to a ruling party, but just general judicial and societal sort of advances or regressions, actually, depending how you look at it. So Nadene, given that as our title, I want to ask you and Michael, are we moving towards a post-Christian society, and what does that mean, Michael?
Well, it's interesting because you would think that the answer would be no, we're not. But unfortunately, if you look at some of the trends that have happened, and there really has been something of a tectonic shift in the last, say, 40, 50 years. Now, believe it or not, some 40 years ago, I went to the University of Bristol where I studied law. And at that time, it was generally a given that the UK was a Christian Western nation. People weren't very committed necessarily to their faith, broadly speaking, but that was our heritage, and that was what you expected to continue. Fast forward some 40 years, and a pastor in Bristol, simply for reading out scriptures in the street, was arrested for a public nuisance offence and charged and duly fined some 30,000 rand, simply for reading the word of God. Now, if you think of how swiftly, therefore, literally in a generation, you can go from being at least a nominally Christian society to a society which is, in that evidence, almost anti-Christian, is a very swift process. So the answer is yes, we can get there. But of course, what we are saying, and certainly what 4SA exists to try and prevent as best as we can, is that we don't get there, that we do hold the lines. And again, you can unfortunately see this trend coming into South Africa. It's a global trend. It's nothing new to us. We, in fact, are, in a sense, behind the curve. Many countries are a lot more sort of post-Christian than South Africa is. And we have a very large Christian population here in this country. But I'll give you one brief example. Advocate Nadene was involved in a case known as the Oh God case some years ago. And what happened in that case was that an atheist organization, who actually have the name, their initials stand for OGOD, Oh God, they decided that what they wanted was what they called freedom of religion by banning some 71 practices of religion, like praying, reading the Bible, nativity plays, you name it. They wanted that basically banned from schools. They actually didn't want freedom of religion. They wanted freedom from religion. And that has been very much a trend that we've seen internationally as well, pushing religion out of schools. And I'm very happy to say that they failed in their quest. And we now have, and it's important because we've actually done a video, which is on our website, to actually help schools and parents particularly understand that in South Africa, we are not free from religion. We have freedom of religion. It must obviously be representative of the population of the school. There must be a policy, very important, in the school that basically permits it. But thank God today we can still have nativity plays at Christmas. We can still celebrate Easter. We can still have people giving exhortations in school assemblies. So very importantly, we're not there yet, and please God, let us not get there.
Yes, and maybe I can just jump in there, Jackie. Importantly, in that case, actually, the Johannesburg High Court, a 3-judge bench of the Johannesburg High Court, was actually the Pretoria High Court, said very importantly, South Africa is not a secular state. And we hear that being thrown around so often. South Africa is a secular state, almost as a way of preventing people from speaking their Christian beliefs or their religious beliefs or their living out their beliefs. But that is not the case in South Africa. We're not a secular state. We're not, in that sense, like America, where no religion is allowed in schools or to be practiced in state-aided institutions. In South Africa, what we have is religion is welcome in those spaces, in public schools, in state-aided institutions, as long as there is equality for everybody to live out and celebrate their religious practices. So just to say we're not the same as America, there where there's that strict wall of separation. No, we welcome that into our public space as long as everybody's on the same footing. So we're not a secular state.
So that is really quite surprising for me to hear. I mean, I would consider myself fairly educated, but I did not realize that. And in fact, whilst you were talking, I was looking down at my notes here. But Nadene, if I may then ask on that point, and Michael, feel free to jump in on this as well. But if you say that we are not like America or sort of a secular state by definition, how does that relate in the Christian context when it's a government school? Because it seems to me like even if a school might say they're Christian, if the government dictates you will teach this or you will not teach this, what kind of sort of autonomy does the school have to actually, or the parents, to decide what they want to put in their school?
So very important question, and that was exactly what the OGOD case was about, Jackie, because in that instance, really, the court once again confirmed what is basically written into our constitution in section 15.2, which is the section that relates to religious freedom. And section 15.2 of the constitution specifically says religious observances may take place at state or state-aided institutions, including therefore public schools, provided it meets 3 conditions. Number 1, it must take place in terms of rules established in the case of public schools by school governing bodies. In other words, it can't just be random, changing from the one day to the next. There needs to be a policy regarding religious observances in the schools. Secondly, it must take place on a free and voluntary basis. In other words, no one should be forced to attend, for instance, Christian assembly or, nativity play. And thirdly, as long as it happens on an equitable basis. And what that means is exactly what I explained just now. In other words, everyone's free to live out their faith. There should be equal space. If people of different faiths want that opportunity to live out their faith, they should be allowed to do so. So it's not like in America where we're saying, no, religion is allowed in school. It is very much allowed, but under those 3 conditions. However, what the court made very clear also in the OGOD case is, and that is maybe the slight shift to what it was before, is that because of that, and because public schools in a sense are seen as public assets that serve the society and therefore need in a sense to represent our diverse and society where there is a plurality of religions, it needs to look like that. No public school may hold itself out as a school holding to a particular religious ethos. For instance, no public school may say we promote a Christian ethos or we are a Christian school, because there needs to be equal space for everybody to be welcome, to be admitted, and actually to live out their faith in the context of a public school.
Yeah, so you can't, for example, call yourself so-and-so Christian high school Weinberg.
Yeah.
You can't have, your blazer with, the way, the truth, and the life, or a cross on it, or something like that. But apart from that, and I think this is probably the most important thing for parents to note, and for schools for that matter to understand, is that we are not free from religion. We have freedom of religion. It is a good thing. And our constitution even encourages it, and this judgment has settled it, that schools are a place where students, staff are free to celebrate and live out their religion, obviously within the confines as Nadene has explained.
And how that looks from school to school may vary. It doesn't mean that one Monday in school assembly they need to read from the Bible, the next Monday from the Quran, or dedicate 5 minutes to each religion per assembly. Once again, you would take into account the learner makeup of that particular school, and it may be in therefore that all the Christians gather just for practical purposes, and because maybe they're the most number of learners in school assembly, where they have 10 minutes of the dominee or the pastor coming in and reading from the Bible, but that needs to happen on a free and voluntary basis. And if the Muslims want the same space for the imam to come teach them in a classroom, then they should be dedicated the same amount of space and time. So in that sense, equality in the schools in order to be instructed in and to live out their faith. So that's really the outcome of the OGOD case.
Yes.
And it's in line with the Constitution.
Yeah, and again, if 4SA had not been on the forefront of being involved in fighting that case, it may look very different.
It could have had a very different outcome.
Yeah, for sure.
And that's often, we always say we stand on the shoulders of those who've come before us, and certainly Christians today, children today, parents today probably don't even realize the battle that you guys had. I remember back in the day, Joy being part of, organizing prayer initiatives and publicity around the OGOD case, because it really was a precedent-setting matter. So let me ask you this. I've got quite a few questions, but let's just come back quickly on the school thing. So if I may ask you, because this is a question that I think a lot of parents have, is you've outlined what happens in a government school setting. In a private school setting, now this may be different, I suppose, overseas, but in South Africa, if your school has an ethos, a code of conduct, and let's say in this instance, it's christianschool.com, it's very obvious the school's Christian. Now, pupils coming in, they need to sign a code of conduct, they need to acknowledge sort of the principles of the school. Can private schools actually have those parameters, and is it reasonable to expect that they can operate with quite a lot of confidence within those parameters because people have signed the code of conduct and the ethos?
Yeah. So Jackie, once again, our starting point is the Constitution, and 2 sections in particular. So section 29(3), I think it is, of the Constitution specifically provides for the establishing of independent schools. And it says that independent schools may not discriminate on grounds of race. And that's the only ground it mentions, the implication being that independent schools, different to public schools, may discriminate fairly on the basis of, say, gender. That's why you would have girls-only schools, or on the basis of language. That's why you would have a German independent school. And on the basis of religion also, and that's why you would have Christian or Muslim independent schools. And that is also then repeated in section 31 of the Constitution, which specifically makes provision for the establishing of independent schools, once again based on culture, language, or religion. So clearly, even in terms of the Constitution, there is much greater freedom for independent schools, which are typically established because there are like-minded people, parents, teachers, who, because of their shared faith and values, come together and establish that school. So even in law, in terms of the jurisprudence, much greater freedom. However, right now, there is a case that 4SA is involved in that might upset literally years of jurisprudence if it goes against the school. So just briefly, the facts, and I think we've referred to it in other webinars as well, it's called the so-called Isiphandla case. And what happened in that case, it relates to a Christian private school in Johannesburg. So clearly the statement of faith, the code of conduct, everything is Christian, and parents very much know that when they sign up at the school. So a little Zulu boy, 9-year-old Zulu boy, arrived at school with the Isiphandla, which is the wristband that some of the African people wear around their wrist that signifies a connection with their ancestors. And the school said that goes against our biblical ethos because we don't believe in any connection or communication with the dead. So we unfortunately cannot allow that on the school grounds. We, not just our curriculum, but everything we do at the school, everything that we permit or don't permit is basically infused with Christian values and beliefs. So they said to the boy, we're going to send you home with your schoolwork for the Isiphandla to fall off naturally, as it has to do in terms of custom, and then you're welcome to come back to the school. So the parents have now sued this Christian independent school for 300,000 Rand in the Johannesburg High Court because they're saying that the school's religious beliefs infringe their cultural beliefs. They're saying we're also Christians, but we also hold to culture. And so this will really be a groundbreaking case, not only for independent schools of a Christian faith, but in fact for any other independent faith-based school. Because the question ultimately is, if parents, knowing what they sign up to, what values and beliefs they come up to, nonetheless choose to voluntarily associate with themselves with that school, can they then subsequently dictate to the school to actually change their beliefs to accommodate, what they believe, and what, even if it goes directly against the school? So the question really is, to what extent should the 99% accommodate the 1%, even if the 1%'s beliefs and values go against the school's beliefs and values? So it could potentially be also another groundbreaking precedent-setting case for SA is involved in that case as a friend of the courts to make sure that this principle of institutional autonomy and therefore, in other words, the rights of private religious organizations to determine their own doctrines, to regulate their own affairs according to their beliefs and values, to make sure that remains protected. Otherwise, it will literally upset years of jurisprudence relating to freedom of association.
So Nadene, given what you've just said, we obviously as a Christian community at large need to be praying for you guys and praying for the outcome of this case. When do you expect that this goes to court or something?
It has been set down for hearing on the 19th of January, Jackie, so it's coming up soon.
Okay, all right. Well, we'll certainly keep that in prayer. And let me ask you guys, because, coming back to the topic which relates to actually what we're saying, some possibly naive Christians might look at all of this and say, you know what, we shouldn't actually have religion in schools. And you know what, if people don't want to be Christian, just leave them and we'll carry on in our churches and we'll do our own thing. And as we kind of touched on last week, part of the naivety of that thinking is that you might think that it's okay if you just left alone to be a Christian in your little circle, but when you start removing religion out of society, it removes your ability to live out your Christianity through soup kitchens, outreaches, any kind of
your Christian witness.
Yes, any kind of public Christian witness. So that's the slippery slope. But in terms of a post-Christian society, so as you said, Michael, South Africa is a little bit behind, fortunately, to trends globally speaking, but we are moving there slowly but surely. And that's where really it's an indictment to the Christian church, because our apathy has also led to the acceleration of other activists and other agendas being pushed forward. Because when a certain movement wants to mobilize, they get a lot of participation and people show up for protests, or they write in, or they complain to government or business entities. And sometimes Christians are reactive, which is unfortunate. Now, with the recent hate speech bill, I'm glad to see that people did mobilize, but we obviously need more of that. Let me ask you guys, in terms of if South Africa did really cross the line to become a post-Christian society, what would that look like, practically speaking, for you and me and the church on the corner?
Yeah,
I think the important thing to understand is that there's no such thing as a value-neutral society. And just as nature abhors a vacuum, well, society abhors a vacuum. There's always going to be some values that are going to fill any society. And the question is, whose values? And our absolute firm conviction belief is that freedom of religion is so important because it keeps the space basically open for all ideologies to coexist. And that is the essence of what our Constitution envisages. Our Constitution envisages a society where we celebrate our diversity, where people of all sorts of different ethnicities and faiths and colors and creeds and what have you can coexist together in a harmonious state. It does not envisage, which is often the trend when you get towards secularism, a kind of a winner-takes-all situation, which effectively amounts to totalitarianism, where one particular ideology is effectively crammed down on others using the levers of power. And frankly, any society where government power is used to enforce or push a particular ideology is in danger of becoming the equivalent of a totalitarian state. So the ideal is that we literally live in a society which our Constitution envisages, where we all have the opportunity to live out, to celebrate, to teach, to preach, to share, to pass on our faith. And that is really the wonderful, I think, opportunity that all faiths have. But let's speak particularly about Christianity, because the job of Christians, and pastors particularly as religious leaders, is to preach, is to teach the gospel, is to disciple nations. That is essentially what we need to do. But we do need to be free to do it. And so it's not that our freedom is there in that sense as our right, but it's actually our responsibility. And while we can live in a society where we are given these rights, then we have the opportunity to actually exercise our duty to our fellow man, if you like, to make sure that we share and live out and make our faith as attractive as we possibly can to others.
Yeah, absolutely. But then to your point, Michael, and I don't want to sound pessimistic here, but I think I'm expressing what a lot of people think, is we know that a post-Christian society is a negative thing. We know that removing Christian values and Judeo-Christian principles out of society has a, broadly speaking, negative impact on all levels of society. But at the same time, we are very small cogs in a very massive wheel, and even on an international level, really, does South Africa even have say over a lot of our own policies, because we're bought by people like the IMF and, you know, other entities. So given sort of the negative outlook and watching how other Western nations have progressed, can 4SA make a difference? Can Christians actually stand up? Can we actually preserve Christianity in society? Shouldn't we all just give up and go live under a bunker somewhere?
No. Absolutely not. You know, what affects change in a society is typically when a small and committed minority becomes sufficiently vocal and passionate that the vast majority of people just go, okay, let's just back off. It happens time and time again. You know, every ideological faction that's ever taken over a society has started off with a small, very vocal, very committed, very mobilized, very motivated minority that have taken over key institutions, and then using that power, they've managed to leverage the rest of society in the direction that they want to go, despite the fact that the vast majority of people, as is the case in this country, are very much people of faith, and the Christian faith in particular. So what we have to do is we have to make sure that we don't just back off, that we don't just lie down, go and live under a bush, or whatever analogy you were using, that we actually stand up and we say, no, we're not going to be dictated to. We're not going to just allow these laws to be passed that are going to take away our fundamental freedoms or make it increasingly difficult for us to share our faith. We're not going to do that. And that's really what 4SA does try to do. We try to, particularly when it comes to some of the bills that we've seen, to actually make sure that people understand what they are, to try and put them in layman's terms, and then to give people the tools that they need, whether they're pro forma submissions or whatever it may be, so that they can actually make their voice heard. Because by speaking up and by speaking out, we can, in fact, arrest and even reverse the trend.
And more than that, Jackie, what we do is we put the arguments really in the hands of the parliamentarians. Because at the end of the day, we so often just hear, you know, equality being shouted, but there are also religious rights are no less worthy of protection than, for instance, equality rights. You know, our Constitutional Court has on various occasions already said we don't have a hierarchy of rights. And that means that inherently no one right is more important than another, should always weigh more heavily than another right. And so what we do is we literally put the arguments in the hands of the parliamentarians to say, well, it may be that there's a push for equality in this particular bill, but how ought it to be balanced in light of case law with religious rights to make sure that the objectives are met, but done in such a way that other constitutional rights, and in particular the right to religious freedom, remains protected. And we do that often by, for instance, if there's a practical problem, say the Civil Union Amendment Bill, where literally there weren't enough state-employed marriage officers to marry LGBT people in the rural areas. So we put forward the practical solutions as to how that can be addressed before we just infringe the religious rights of state-employed marriage officers. So that's what we do, to literally put the arguments in the hands of parliamentarians as well, who ultimately do make these decisions.
No, look, that's great. And I certainly agree with you guys that we can't give up and we have to keep pushing, pushing back against the agenda. But what would you guys say, just very briefly, because I do want to move on to the next question and I'm respectful of everyone's time, but I think this is an important sort of criticism that's levied against Christians who want to take up the cause is, depending on your eschatology, persecution is abounding, the world's going to get dark, persecution is going to get worse. So at the end of the day, are you guys not fighting a losing battle?
Yeah, that is a question we often get asked, Jackie. And I think persecution, sounds, a lot of people say, bring on persecution, it's going to happen anyway, and often refer to the church in China. See how the church in China is flourishing under persecution. Well, practically the church died in Russia under persecution. And I think a lot of people at the end of the day romanticize persecution. But when you read the books and you actually hear the accounts of people who have been persecuted and are living in a state of persecution, where they are literally martyred, tortured, killed for their faith, see their women and their kids being tortured in front of their eyes. It's a very different story, whereas I think sometimes we can be very idealistic about it. And maybe, we can say in a Western context, well, those things don't happen in a Western context, it only happens in the Middle East. It'll never happen in South Africa. Well, maybe not, but people do get sued personally and in their business capacity, literally for every last cent, every last belonging that they have. There's that well-known case of Badenhorst, the florist in America, who was sued because of her religious convictions. And she was sued not only in a business, in a professional capacity, but personally for every last thing that she had, if only she would compromise on a religious belief. So there really is a big price tag, a real risk that you may lose not just your business, but your house and everything that you have, if we don't stand up for religious freedom. And so our job as 4SA really is, and why we do what we do, is to keep the doors for the gospel open as wide as possible for as long as possible, so that more people can come to a saving knowledge of Jesus Christ. Because how much better is it to live in a country where you are free to share the good news, to share your religious convictions with a friend, a neighbor, colleague, without worrying that they're going to open up a charge against you with the police, and next moment you are going to be arrested, your family is going to be taken away, you don't know what's happened to them, and those are very real realities. So absolutely we need to work for freedom, and we need others to partner, individuals and religious organizations to partner with us in order to be able to do that, because we one voice, but ultimately we do live in a democracy where numbers count, and all the more so around election time. So, and if we say we're a country where 80% of the people profess to be Christian, well, then we have a very loud voice, and that voice needs to speak to those who are in power to make sure that our rights remain protected and are not just trampled underfoot.
Absolutely, Nadene. And I mean, we all feel very strongly about this, in our private capacities, that if Christians support Christian organizations, if you read Christian media, if you watch Christian films, if you attend Christian events, if you donate to Christian organizations, we will see that buying power and that solidarity work for us and be able to effect change and make a difference. And my husband and I often argue at home, because he loves to quote that stat, 80% of South Africa is Christian. And then I'm always like, please, what does that mean? But the point is, if every couch potato Christian actually realized what society will look like if religion and Christianity is removed or prohibited, then that should motivate them to actually speak up. And yeah, that's why what you guys do is so critical. And again, I know I'm preaching to the choir, because many of you who've signed on tonight, obviously you recognize the need for an organization like 4SA, but I want to encourage those of you at home that not only do they need our prayers, but they need our support financially. They need opportunity to speak and host webinars and come to churches and do training. We were speaking, I think it was a week or two ago at one of the webinars, about just the need that you guys fulfill in helping pastors navigate what they can and can't say from the pulpit, because that's a minefield. Mm-hmm. And especially if you are someone like myself who is quite passionate and just like says what I think, you can't really do that. So it's not to say that you muzzle yourself, but you need wisdom. And that's a biblical, directive, is we need to have wisdom, we need to have humility and kindness, but we need to also be strategic. So I certainly appreciate what you guys are doing, and even though perhaps on screen it looks like the numbers are low for attendance with the webinars, I know that a lot of people watch post. But more importantly, to those of you watching at home, please forward these links to your pastors and your leaders, because it's so important that Christians wake up. We are sleeping giants, and yet we can still preserve society with salt and light. And that is, you can't give up. If you give up, then you may as well just book your ticket to heaven. We've got to hold the bastions of faith and freedom and, Christian values until the very end. So let me ask you guys, I know you've done so much, but just in summary, how long have you been going? What are some of the victories that you have experienced and fought for? And what are some of the cases you're currently busy with?
Okay, shall I jump in first? And then you can talk about, right. So yeah, I've been involved with the organization since the inception. When we started in 2014, I'm one of the founding members along with Pastor Andrew Selly. And then Michael, what year did you?
About 2 years later.
About 2 years later, yes. So we've been going for about 8 years. And as I said, the workload really, as this trajectory is moving towards a post-Christian world, really is the workload is just increasing. So we've had a number of victories in the past. As I said in the beginning, we're involved in different arenas, government policy, before parliaments, before court. So maybe I'll just mention on the court case side and the law side, Michael, and then you can mention on the policy side. So court cases, Michael's already mentioned the OGOD case where I was personally involved as an advocate to make sure that we live in a country where we don't have freedom from religion in schools, in public schools, but freedom of religion, and where the court actually affirmed the constitutional court principle that we do not live in a secular state, but religion is allowed in schools. So that was a very big one. Then I've already made mention of the Isipandla case. That is the case in independent faith-based schools that we're busy with right now, that will be going to court in January to again protect the freedom of independent faith-based schools to remain schools that can celebrate a particular faith, or because that's the very reason why they're independent schools in the first place. And then another big case that is coming up for us from the 22nd to the 24th of November, Jackie, is a case that we actually instituted against government in January this year already. And you'll remember that in December and January, I think for a period of about 4 weeks altogether, there was a complete shutdown, a complete ban on churches under the lockdown regulations, even though other establishments such as restaurants and casinos and cinemas were allowed to operate and people were allowed to gather there. The church was completely shut down. And so at that stage already, we opened up an urgent case against government to say, come explain why you're saying that in a church where all the protocols are maintained, there's a higher risk of transmission than at any of these establishments where, for instance, in a restaurant, people take off their masks to eat and drink. They definitely don't keep 1.5 meters social distance. And so that case, when we brought the court challenge initially, government almost immediately conceded that they were in the wrong, and opened up churches. However, that case remains important because of the principles that we need to establish, the principles relating to the reasons for which and the extent to which government can just infringe on our religious rights. And so that case will now ultimately be heard in November. As I say, that will be a very important precedent-setting case, particularly in light of further waves. We know that government's already speaking about a fourth wave that's making its way in December. Who knows? So that will be a very important one. So that's on the court case front. I mean, those are just a few examples. There are many more court cases that we're involved in. And then on the law side, you've also mentioned these two, maybe two of the big ones that have made news and media highlights in the last year would be the Papuda Bill. Papuda Bill being a strengthening of the existing Papuda Act or Equality Act. Now, that is already the act in terms of which a lot of unfair discrimination and hate speech cases are being brought against Christians to either silence them from speaking their fundamentalist, narrow-minded, bigoted, politically incorrect beliefs, or to force them to compromise on actually living out their beliefs. And what this bill will do is just make it so much easier for activists who drive a liberal agenda to bring these kind of cases against Christians, and also for government to interfere in the internal affairs of churches, to regulate matters such as who should be admitted into membership, who should serve in the leadership of a church, who should be employed or not be employed by the church. So that was a very important bill, that there was a major pushback from the public. And as a result of that major pushback, and this is an example of how when we do speak up, we can make a difference. For us, I was actually given a meeting with the Deputy Minister of Justice, a meeting where he conceded, well, perhaps they didn't look at religious rights carefully enough when they drafted this bill, and he gave an undertaking that they would actually relook this bill to make sure that religious rights remain protected. And we were only able to do that because of the major pushback from the public. And then the same, of course, goes for the hate speech bill, which was the most recent one. The danger of the hate speech bill is that for the first time in South African law, it will make certain forms of offensive speech a crime. So that means if somebody doesn't like what you're saying, doesn't agree with, finds it offensive, they could potentially lay a criminal charge against you with police. You could get arrested and then prosecuted, and if found guilty, fined to a fine or even 3 years jail time. So that is massive for South Africa. And again, there was a major pushback from the public on that bill. On the DRSA platform alone, there was some 103,000 comments that were made. And again, because of that major pushback, we believe that the bill, that Parliament will have to look really seriously at the bill to see how it can be tweaked to make sure that freedom of expression, and in particular freedom of religious expression, remains protected. So those are just a few examples of some of the victories and efforts that we've been involved with in the last number of years. Michael, do you want to jump in with policy?
Yeah, and I think that's very importantly, those show the power when people start to exercise their democratic rights to engage in these vital lawmaking processes. And the same goes for policies too. You know, we had a situation, which I'm sure you'll remember some years ago now, but it amazingly persisted. It was approximately a 3 or 4 year struggle where government, essentially through the CRL Rights Commission, were proposing some form of state regulation of religion. And it is absolutely apparent, and human history is literally littered with casualties, that where government starts to take the control of what people can and cannot believe and starts to use government power to enforce that or to prevent people, it literally ends in disaster. It's interesting that we are celebrating Religious Freedom Month in October. And on the 27th is Religious Freedom Day. And this reason why we have a Religious Freedom Day goes back to the colony of the Bay, Massachusetts Bay Colony, where the Puritans, who had come across from fleeing religious persecution in England, arrived in the New World, set up their governments, established their structures and education and everything. And then another grouping, who happened to be the Quakers, had a different revelation from the one that the Puritan government or the Puritans believed, and they used the power of government to literally execute, to put to death people who now had a different faith than they did. And that is why these things are so important. At a policy level, we have to make sure that government does not get control of religion. Another area where ideologies have been hard fought has been, of course, in the area of comprehensive sexuality education, CSE, where government, again, was pushing very hard to put a particular and very liberal value-ridden content into the life skills and life orientation aspect of the curriculum. And again, we took the stand, look, if schools want that, if parents want that, because they have the primary responsibility to educate their children according to their own values, then fair enough. But parents should not have any form of ideological basis forced upon their children through the education system. So when it comes to policies, we have stood up. Marriage would be another area where we've been very, very strongly involved, particularly to say that even though pastors particularly are standing in the place of the state when they do some of the aspects of the marriage, they are not employed by the state, and the state therefore should not be able to dictate who or what type of marriage a pastor is willing to solemnize or to officiate at. And yet, even in the policies, even despite the submissions, and we're going to need to do more on this, it's still open as to whether or not maybe there will be some pressure placed upon religious marriage officers to actually solemnize all types of marriage. We say absolutely not. But again, we have to get involved in these policy issues as well, because they are what actually leads to then laws being passed, which subsequently severely can impact and even curtail our religious freedom rights.
Now, I obviously see the clock racing on, but having said that, I think tonight is so important, and what we're discussing, if the viewers at home don't mind, I'm just going to take a few more minutes over 8 o'clock. And I obviously see some very interesting comments and questions coming through, and I really appreciate everyone's engagement. So let me ask you guys, and whoever wants to answer on this, but listening to all the work you do and knowing a slight inkling of how much work goes in on a legal submission, and just, I mean, just the paper alone. When I saw back in the day, I was involved when they wanted to decriminalize prostitution for the World Cup, and I could not believe how much paper was used in the submissions. It was insane. So given all of that, how much does it cost, for example, for you guys? Obviously your staffing cost is a different story, but like to actually present a case, to bring it to the court, the amount of hours, the months you work on it. Yeah. I mean, you probably can't quantify cost, but if you had to give someone an idea, how long does it take to work on a submission on the legal side in terms of for the courts, and how much does it cost? Because I think people have no idea.
Jackie, very difficult to answer because it just depends on, the magnitude of the case. But for instance, if I can say, in the lockdown matter alone, where we're challenging governments, I mean, at the initial stage in January, for that stage, to prepare the urgent application, I'm not talking about all the work that happened after that. I think I alone put in 100 hours of work. And then we're working with an external team of lawyers, who are putting in also their time, their effort, high-level expertise, and each one of them would have spent in excess of 100 hours as well, so that it was at least another 3 advocates putting in the same, if not more hours. And that was just the first stage of the process. I've actually lost count of the number of hours spent when we prepare legal submissions, easily.
I think just to go back to this one particular case, because it is a good case in point. If everybody had charged what they reasonably would be entitled to charge, we would be looking at, probably by the time we get to the first instance, which is the High Court, which is taking place in November, probably somewhere between 1.5 to 2 million rands worth of costs.
That's far in excess of that already.
So we are literally talking about huge sums of money. And here's the thing, we basically do it based on voluntary donations. And we do not charge those figures. We basically, Nadene is paid a salary. It is so important that people understand, though, that on the other side, there's big money involved. When we were in the so-called spanking case, and there were some 9 other parties that were arrayed against us, that was in the Constitutional Court. Each one of those parties, their cost for the single day would have probably been in excess of R1 million. So there are people who are on the other side who will stump up big bucks to get their viewpoint pushed into law and enforced. And that is why it is so important that we develop, among other things, something of a war chest, so that we can fight these matters. And that's why we appeal to people not only to just support us in their prayers, which is obviously very important, but also to support us with finances. And it's amazing, a 50 Rand contribution, 100 Rand contribution a month goes a long way. Many of those, and we would be in so much of a better space than we are.
What he said.
I actually get a little bit emotional listening to you guys speak, because when I think about the sacrifices that you and your team put together, sacrifices of your time, sacrifices of your finances, because I know, Nadene, you could be earning hundreds of thousands more if you were in private practice working for secular cases, the sacrifice of your reputations, because I would imagine you probably come under a lot of flack, spiritually speaking, but also when you get on the radar of some of these organizations, they're quite nasty. And I can imagine there's a great cost. And all I can say to you guys is, sure, I know that the Lord has big treasures in heaven for you. But at the same time, that doesn't pay the bills. And it's not about your bills, because you guys have volunteered your time and your expertise. But it's the bills of fighting, the cost of fighting for freedom. It takes money to fight for freedom.
Absolutely.
And as you rightly said, the other side always seems to be very well funded, which is why they can make such massive gains. And yet God has given the church and his bride capacity and ability to generate wealth, and we need to bring that into the kingdom. I think sometimes what happens is a lot of Christians support soft organizations because it feels good. You support a missionary organization that's giving children water in Africa, and there's nothing wrong with that. That's really important. But what people don't realize is if they don't support what you do, the people that are doing gospel outreaches won't be able to do that. Because if our society removes our right to do that, then it doesn't matter how much you fund a missionary organization or a church outreach, they can't do it.
Build the beautiful buildings or whatever, because if we don't have freedom, then we can't publicly share our faith, and we can't, as you say, go out and witness. So it is really core to ultimately to the gospel mandate.
So we are really appealing to people. We've been doing this now 8 years, and I think in the 8 years that we've been doing this, we have literally held back what would be, I think, a very different context for faith in South Africa than would otherwise have been the case. I think I can say that without fear of contradiction. And the reality is there's literally been 3 of us that have done it. And we've done it literally on a shoestring. And it is a lot of work. I mean, Nadene, Daniela work tirelessly every hour that God gives them, some that he probably hasn't. And we need the support. We need to have a bigger team. Because unless we can get this thing to another level, we're not going to be able to do what we need to do. And a lot is going to come our way in the future. So we are really appealing to people.
Jackie, we are, people often ask what's the difference between us and other Christian organizations who work maybe for family-related issues or whatever. The difference is this: 4SA is the only organization in South Africa who is single-mindedly focused on protecting religious freedom. So yes, there are times when we collaborate with some of the other organizations, but none of them have the particular mandates that we have. And for that reason, it is vital that we are in a position where we are able to continue our work to keep the doors for the gospel open in South Africa, and to make sure that we have the legal rights, not only as churches, but as every individual in South Africa, to live out our faith and to freely share our faith.
And to that point, some of the other Christian organizations, like one of the gentlemen mentioned in the comments, they're not always on the same page as us either. And in theory, all Christians, certainly on biblical Judeo values, should be on the same page. But if an organization has become sort of captured by political economic forces, they end up being soft on tough issues. So when you are independent, as 4SA is, I think you walk a very narrow road. But having said all of that, it's amazing to look back over the last 8 and 9 years and see what God has done.
God's faithfulness.
His faithfulness in and through your team and through the wonderful supporters that you do have. I know there's many faithful folks that give their little monthly contribution, and it's amazing to see how we don't have to be when you one with God is a majority, basically, is what I'm trying to say. So there's countless examples in the Bible of how God uses the things of the foolish to confound the wise. And I'm sure a lot of those organizations that you come up against, if they truly knew how small your team is, they would be like, no, this is impossible. Like, how can they do these things? So I do believe that the Lord gives you supernatural favor and strength. But at the same time, we need to stand together. So let me just end off tonight by asking you guys, you've mentioned the donations, obviously, and I know that on your website, there's all the details of how one can give. But then practically speaking, how can people get involved in the cause? Because we don't always know, when certain bills are coming, and maybe you hear via a WhatsApp or something, but how can people be accurately informed?
Excellent question. So, Jackie, I always say it's a time for us to be like the men of Issachar, who not only understood the signs of the times, but knew what to do about it. So it's very important to be informed, firstly, of what are the challenges that we as Christians are facing in South Africa, but not just to know, but to actually know what to do about it and to do something about it. And so the first thing definitely is to be informed, and people can be informed by going to our website, where we regularly post videos, articles, and then also sign up for our newsletter. It's completely for free, and we send out that newsletter on a quarterly basis. We'll send one out next month. But in addition to that, we also send out alerts. If there's any new government policy, any new law that pops up, we alert the public to that if you signed up to our newsletter. And we also tell you what to do about it, how to make a submission, when the deadline is, and we'll often prepare kind of template submissions, because a lot of these things are legally complex, and so we try and break it down into layman's language to say both what the problem is and what we propose how the law should be amended to protect our religious rights. And people can literally use that as background information to write up their own thing, or they can copy paste it. So the first thing is be informed. Invite us to come speak at your churches. We do that. We're based in Cape Town, but we travel around the country. Obviously, with online technology nowadays, things are a lot easier to pull a forum together, and we'll gladly speak to your leaders, to your people. It's so important that every church, every leader, every believer, leader or saint, understands the challenges and know what to do about it and get involved. So take action when there's opportunity to give input. You know, we've been given democratic rights in this country, and we really only have ourselves to blame if we don't use those rights we've been given to influence the policy and lawmaking process. And ultimately, if the results come out and they're not good and we haven't participated well, then the finger only points at us. Just a quick one. People often ask, what about petitions? Petitions are great in terms of, you know, getting kind of public involved in a groundswell, but ultimately they don't count for much before Parliament and government. It's important that people understand that, because more important than a petition that's just a name that's signed to something in general is government wants to know, what is the specific problem that you have with this policy? What is the specific problem that you have with this law? And how do you suggest we change it? So a petition, even if there's 100,000 signatures on one document, it counts as one submission. And people need to know that, because we can run ourselves absolutely ragged, you know, with trying to get all these signatures, but they don't count for much in the end. So it's much better to use the template submissions that Forrest is preparing, even if it's a brief submission, very short, but that it comes from you as an individual, or from you as an individual church or ministry, that states clearly what the problem is that you have and how you suggest it should be resolved. And so apart from that, and getting really behind Forrest, ultimately we're one voice. But if 100,000 people speak up together with us, then we're in excess of 100,000 who are making their voices known. But apart from that, I want to say it's so important, you've already alluded to this, Jackie, to get involved on a local level. Forrest, I can't get involved in every public school on the SGB. We don't have that space. But as parents, they've been given that space in law. Our public schools is a joint partnership between government and parents to really be the governance structure in the schools. And so it's so important for Christian parents to get involved at a local level in these school governing bodies. Get involved in the local structures, you know, in your municipal area, in your suburb, where we are able to really at that local level influence and have a say in the policies and the bylaws and the rules that come through, and alert us if you become aware of any issue where there may be a potential threat to religious freedom, and we'll gladly assist. That's what we do. So know that if you're in trouble, there's an organization that can help, and send us an email, make a telephone call. That's what we do.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Michael, I'm going to hand back to you to give the final words, but just before I do that, one of the things I want to say to the folks at home as well, which is quite interesting. So some of you may remember several years ago that there was a whole sort of controversy when Woolies wanted to throw out Christian magazines. And interestingly, at the time, what most people don't realize is the reason Woolies went that way was because there was a tiny minority, which I'll get into now, tiny minority, who badgered the supermarkets to say, we don't like the Christian magazines because, you know, they discriminate, and, you know, they were starting already. I mean, I'm talking, that was probably about 10 years ago already. And same thing with Pick and Pay. And when we went into the details to say, okay, well, how many complaints did you get? And can we please just see the information, because then we can address it. There was basically, in the instance of almost getting all the Christian magazines thrown out of Woolies, Pick and Pay, all of them, there was basically, it came down to about, I want to say 30 complaints.
Sure.
But when you got the information, because this was when there was fax machines, when you got the information, which they showed us, most of them came from the same fax number. And then we went to go see, okay, what fax number is that? And I can't say the name of the organization, but it was basically a particular organization. So all they did was they had a secretary sitting at their fax machine, putting on different people's names who were willing to have their names attached to it, and just sending through these complaints on the fax machine and just spamming the buyer's office and their fax machine at Pick and Pan Woolies. Now, that taught me a lesson that it's not necessarily that you need millions to make a difference. You just need to be vocal and you need to be coordinated. And that's the key. And if we have to do it in our own capacity, yes, it gets overwhelming because you don't know where to start. But that's why we have organizations like yourselves, like Joy Magazine, where we work with you to publicize campaigns. We've got Joy News, which is a daily news app that we put out, and newsletters that go out that keep Christians informed. And all you have to do is just participate. And like you said, Nadene, the very first time I ever heard that, putting your name to petition counts as one submission, I was horrified and embarrassed, because I thought, how many times have I done that over the years? And it means nothing. But I want to just ask one last question, then Michael, I'll hand over to you. But I think sometimes the reason that people don't want to put their details into a petition, a submission, where it actually requires your details, is they're worried that maybe, like, I don't know, government gets your name. Yeah, government gets your name and your address, and they realize you're part of XYZ business or you XYZ church or whatever. So what would you guys say in that instance to address that concern? Because I do think that's probably a big reason why people don't actually jump in there and do stuff.
Yeah, to be honest with you, be strong and very courageous. If we do not stand up, then we will be run over. That's the reality of it. That's the way that this thing is going to work. And as you pointed out in your example, a tiny, vocal, committed minority can literally do something which has been potentially completely disruptive to override the faith rights, the beliefs, the enjoyment of the literature that Joy Magazine has produced for who knows how many thousands. And that is what we have to do. It's interesting. I often hear that people say, well, Christians shouldn't get involved in these things. Christians should just take a back seat and just pray. I don't believe that's even biblical. I believe that the Apostle Paul is the best example that we have. He was a Roman citizen, and he was quick to stand on his rights as a Roman citizen. When he was going to be beaten, he said, you cannot beat me. I'm a Roman citizen, and they didn't beat him. And when he had been beaten, he said to the magistrates who'd ordered it, I'm a Roman citizen, you better come over here and walk me out of town by way of apology and recognizing that you've been in the wrong. When there was an assassination attempt on his life, he was given a cohort of cavalry to take him safely from A to B. And ultimately, when God said to him, go to Rome, he went there at Rome's expense because he appealed to Caesar when he wasn't getting justice. So we need to stand on our rights while we have them. If we don't exercise our rights, if we just sit passively back, if we take the view, oh, I better not say anything because somebody might come for me. At some point when they've got everybody else, they're going to come for you anyway. Yeah. So this is the time when we need to stand for our religious freedom rights. And while we have them, I believe we should be fully embracing them, practicing them, and defending and promoting them. Because while we do that, the gospel can continue to be freely preached and proclaimed, and we can pass that faith on to others and to our own families. And it's just the most important thing, I think. And the greatest thing about living in this country is that we do have a constitution that gives us the ability to defend these very things.
Jackie, maybe I know we're running out of time, but just a very practical example. And I love telling the story, and people are always amazed when I tell the story because it's a real life story. So when we were before Parliament with the Civil Union Amendment Bill, when they wanted to basically force state-employed marriage officers to solemnize marriages, even if it goes against the religion, conscience, and belief. We were in Parliament that day, and there were 2 stacks of paper before the chairperson of the committee. And the one was a very small stack of paper. I think there were about 10 submissions that came from the Christian community to say that their conscience should remain protected because, everyone has the right to freedom of conscience belief, whether you're employed by the state or not. So the Constitution says it belongs to everyone. You don't lose it simply because you work for the state. So that was about 10 submissions. On the other hand, there were 400 and something submissions that had been made by the liberal lobbyists. And the chairperson of that committee simply said, well, the people of South Africa had spoken. And with that, state-employed marriage officers literally lost their right to conscientious objection. It was as easy as that. So that's not a good story. But on the other hand, we have a good story. That is the hate speech bill. And when in the previous round, we literally also tens of thousands of people made their voices heard on this issue of speech and being able to remain free to share our beliefs with others. And the Deputy Minister of Justice, John Jeffrey, came in. We had a massive meeting at N1 City with lots of pastors piling in from across the country and, basically defending our right to religious freedom. And it was as a result of that a religious exemption clause was written into the hate speech bill that will protect, at least at this stage, the freedom of pastors to be able to freely share from the pulpit, even the parts of the Bible that are offensive, that people don't like, don't agree with. And so that is a stark contrast of when we don't speak up and when we actually do speak up, the difference that our voice can make.
Absolutely, and I stand corrected, but I think I'm right that when the Civil Unions Bill came into whatever the words are, but when it happened, 4SA wasn't actually around. So that's also the difference, is you guys, having been on the scene now, you are proactive, you are vocal, you are informed, you network, you communicate. And again, it just shows you the value of an organization like yourself. So guys, thank you for watching tonight. Thank you for being with us on this journey. Again, if you have signed up to register for the webinars, you're on our database, so we will send out the recorded links for you to rewatch them and share them, and also obviously keep you informed of future webinars and certainly of upcoming issues that you need to jump on board with. And certainly if we have, or not if, when we have our breakfast, guys, we'll have it next year in the new year, but I think that will be a very interesting breakfast, and certainly I trust it will garner much support for you. So from Joy Magazine's side, we just want to say thank you for the bold and courageous stand that you take, and for all the work and the hours that you put in, not just for us, but for the generations to come. We really appreciate it. And we just
thank you for your partnership, Jackie. We couldn't do it without partners like Joy. So thank you so much.
Yeah, and so I pray that out of these webinars that the Lord will take something that looks small in the natural with the reach, and he will connect you strategically with business people, with pastors, with lay Christians who get the vision and who are willing to count the cost. Because at the end of the day, like you said, Michael, there comes a point where we as Christians have to say, what matters more to you? Your reputation, your possessions, your comfort, or standing up when you're called and counted upon to do that? And the Lord is going to judge us for that. He's going to judge us for where we stood on the line of truth. So on that positive note, good night, everybody. And thank you for being part of this journey together. And we just, we praise the Lord for the work that he does in and through us as humble vessels. So good night and God bless.